I'm a 26-year-old woman with a story that I never thought I'd share, but here we are. To start from the beginning, my parents divorced when I was 10. My dad remarried a couple of years later to a woman named Veronica. At first, she seemed like a dream stepmother, sweet, kind, and always ready with compliments. But once the wedding photos were framed and the honeymoon glow wore off, her true personality came out. Veronica was controlling, manipulative, and had this talent for making herself look like the victim while quietly making everyone around her miserable. My dad worked long hours, often leaving me home alone with her. She used those hours to micromanage every aspect of my life. I went from being a carefree kid to feeling like an unpaid live-in maid. My step-siblings, Jenny then 15 and Mark 13, were treated like royalty. Jenny didn't lift a finger, and Mark was practically coddled. Meanwhile, I was handed a list of chores every day that never seemed to end. When I tried to talk to my dad about how unfair everything was, he'd tell me to be the bigger person. Sometimes he'd side with Veronica, saying she was just trying to run the household efficiently. It felt like he was more interested in keeping the peace than actually listening to me. Despite all of this, I threw myself into school. It became my escape. I stayed late at the library, joined study groups, and did whatever I could to be out of the house. I worked hard and earned top grades, which Veronica pretended to be proud of when people were watching. Behind closed doors, she made snide comments about how I was too focused on academics and not well-rounded like Jenny, who spent most of her time on social media and shopping trips. The final straw came when I started applying for colleges. I was so excited to get my acceptance letters, but they weren't arriving. At first, I thought it was just a delay, but then I found a stash of them in Veronica's drawer. She'd been hiding them. Her reasoning? She thought I was too young to live alone and wanted me to stay home to help out. I was furious, but I didn't let her win. I managed to apply to a prestigious university just in time and got in on a full scholarship. The day I left for college was the first time I felt like I could breathe. Veronica put on this show of being sad to see me go, even shedding fake tears, but I knew better. My dad barely said goodbye, probably because he didn't want to deal with her wrath for too long. I decided then and there to cut contact with Veronica, though I tried to maintain a polite but distant relationship with my dad. College was a fresh start. I worked part-time jobs, studied like crazy, and didn't look back. By the time I graduated, I had multiple job offers and landed a high-paying position in a growing company. Over the years, I climbed the corporate ladder, putting in long hours and making strategic moves. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. I never wanted to feel powerless again. Meanwhile, the family dynamics back home didn't change much. Veronica still treated Jenny and Mark like they could do no wrong, despite their lack of ambition. She'd call me every so often not to check in on me, but to gloat about how successful her children were. According to her, Jenny was exploring her options translation, doing nothing, and Mark was taking a gap year translation, also doing nothing. At the same time, she'd accuse me of abandoning the family. It was almost laughable, considering how hard I worked to escape their chaos. Then a few months ago, I started hearing whispers about Veronica and my dad's financial troubles. They'd been living beyond their means for years, funding their lifestyle with credit cards and bad investments. My dad had retired early, leaving Veronica in charge of their finances, which turned out to be a terrible idea. I tried not to care, but curiosity got the better of me. A mutual acquaintance mentioned that Veronica's company was on the verge of collapse, which caught my attention for one specific reason. My current role gives me oversight of companies like hers. That's when it hit me. For the first time in my life, I'm in a position where I have the upper hand. I don't want to be petty, but I also can't deny the satisfaction of knowing that karma might finally be catching up with her. I've been strategizing my next steps carefully. This isn't just about revenge, it's about doing what's right, both professionally and personally. So here I am, standing on the edge of what feels like a turning point. Veronica doesn't know what's coming, but I do. And I can't help but wonder how she'll handle it when the tables start to turn. The day the tables started turning came faster than I expected. Veronica's company had been flagged for operational inefficiencies, and as the new director overseeing this sector, it was my responsibility to attend a departmental review meeting. When I walked into the conference room, there she was. Veronica. She didn't notice me at first, too busy making small talk with a few colleagues, but as the introduction started, her eyes locked on me. Her face froze for a moment, and she blinked rapidly as if trying to process what she was seeing. I introduced myself with a calm, professional tone, outlining my role and expectations for the department. Veronica, to her credit, quickly composed herself. She smiled tightly and nodded along, but the tension in her shoulders gave her away. She didn't acknowledge me personally, likely hoping no one would connect the dots about our history. I made sure not to give her the satisfaction. To everyone in that room, she was just another employee and I was just her boss. After the meeting, it didn't take long for people to start talking. Veronica's behavior had been awkward enough to raise eyebrows, and whispers about her sudden change in demeanor spread quickly. I overheard someone joke that she looked like she'd seen a ghost. The truth wasn't far off. As I started reviewing her department's performance reports, I noticed patterns that were all too familiar. Deadlines were consistently missed, her team seemed demoralized, and the overall atmosphere was chaotic. It reminded me of how she used to run our household, micromanaging every little thing while ignoring the bigger picture. I scheduled a follow-up meeting with her team, setting clear and measurable performance goals. The expectations were reasonable, but it was obvious they were going to push her out of her comfort zone. Over the next few weeks, her inability to adapt became glaringly obvious. Tasks were delayed, mistakes piled up, and her team started voicing concerns about her leadership. The cracks in her facade were beginning to show, and I made sure to document everything. One evening, I received an email from Veronica. She requested a private meeting to clear the air. I knew exactly what this was about, but I agreed. When she stepped into my office, she was visibly nervous. She started with pleasantries, then tried to bring up our personal connection, emphasizing that she'd always treated me like her own child. I didn't react, keeping my tone neutral as I redirected the conversation to her performance issues. When it became clear that I wasn't going to be swayed by her emotional appeals, she shifted tactics, blaming her team for the missed deadlines and poor results. I calmly outlined the data I'd collected, showing her exactly where the problems lay and warning her of the potential consequences if things didn't improve. She left the meeting visibly shaken, and I could feel the power dynamic shifting. For the first time, she couldn't manipulate her way out of a tough situation. That evening, my dad called. I knew it wasn't a coincidence. Veronica must have told him her version of events, painting me as vindictive or unprofessional. He started with small talk but quickly shifted to asking me to go easy on her. I listened patiently, then explained the situation in simple terms. Her department was underperforming, and as her superior, I had a responsibility to address it. He sighed heavily, clearly uncomfortable, but I didn't budge. This wasn't about family, it was about doing my job. In the weeks that followed, Veronica's desperation became more apparent. She started cozying up to certain colleagues, trying to rally support against me. But my reputation in the company was solid, and her efforts only made her look worse. Meanwhile, her performance continued to decline. She missed a critical deadline that cost the company a major client, which triggered a formal review of her role. Veronica's stress was starting to show. She snapped at her team more frequently, and her usual polished demeanor began to slip. She even started avoiding me in the office, a far cry from the confident, domineering woman I'd grown up with. It was as if she finally realized that her old tactics weren't going to work anymore. At home, things weren't much better for her. From what I gathered through mutual acquaintances, she'd been venting to my dad about how unfairly she was being treated at work. But instead of sympathy, she was met with his growing frustration. Their financial troubles were worsening, and he was beginning to see the cracks in the image she'd worked so hard to maintain. As for me, I kept my focus. I continued documenting her mistakes, ensuring that if this escalated further, I'd have everything I needed to back up my decisions. It wasn't about revenge, it was about holding her accountable. For years, she'd managed to evade consequences, but now the walls were closing in. Veronica's growing desperation was almost palpable. She started arriving at work earlier and staying later, likely trying to fix the mess she'd created. But it was too little, too late. The pressure was getting to her, and for the first time, I saw a side of her I'd never seen before: vulnerability. Whether it was the moment Veronica's major mistake came to light, the office atmosphere shifted dramatically. She had mishandled a key client account, resulting in the client pulling their business. It wasn't just a minor misstep. The loss was significant enough to affect the department's quarterly performance metrics. The higher-ups were livid, and as the director overseeing her department, I was required to initiate a formal performance review. This wasn't something I could overlook, even if I had wanted to. Veronica was called into a meeting with HR and myself to discuss the situation. Her defensiveness was immediate. She blamed everyone but herself. She claimed her team hadn't followed her instructions properly, that the client's demands were unreasonable, and even hinted that other departments were sabotaging her. The excuses didn't hold up under scrutiny, and the evidence painted a clear picture. Her poor leadership was the root of the problem. The review officially placed her on a performance improvement plan, with strict deadlines and clear goals. It was a professional warning shot, but her reaction afterward was far from professional. That evening, she showed up at my office unannounced. Her face was red and she was visibly upset. She launched into accusations, claiming that I was targeting her out of personal spite. She even went as far as to call me ungrateful, reminding me of how she took me in when my parents divorced. It was the first time she had directly brought up our family connection in the workplace, and I knew I couldn't let it slide. I stayed calm and laid it all out. I recounted how she had treated me during my teenage years, the disproportionate chores, the belittling comments, and even the time she hid my college acceptance letters. I reminded her of how she had made me feel like an outsider in my own home, all while pampering her own children. She looked stunned for a moment, then shook her head, dismissing my words as exaggerations. She insisted that she had always treated me like her own child, a statement so absurd it almost made me laugh. I didn't let her gaslighting derail the conversation. I provided specific examples of her favoritism, how Jenny and Mark were exempt from any responsibilities while I was practically running the household. I described the time she undermined my academic achievements, downplayed my success, and tried to hold me back from leaving for college. Her expression hardened as I spoke, but she didn't interrupt. By the time I finished, she was uncharacteristically quiet. It was clear she had no rebuttal. Word of her outburst must have spread, because the next day, a few colleagues approached me privately to offer their support. They shared stories of how Veronica's behavior had negatively affected the team. One person described how she often micromanaged projects to the point of inefficiency, while another mentioned her tendency to take credit for others' work. It was clear that her reputation within the company wasn't as untouchable as she might have thought. The following week, during a scheduled performance review meeting, I informed Veronica that termination was on the table if her performance didn't improve drastically. Her demeanor shifted again, from defensive to desperate. She asked for another chance, promising to turn things around, but the data didn't lie. I explained that the decision wasn't personal, it was based on her track record. She left the meeting visibly shaken, and I braced myself for the fallout. That fallout came swiftly. Veronica confided in my dad, twisting the story to make herself look like the victim. She claimed I was using my position to settle old grudges and painted herself as the one trying to maintain professionalism. My dad, predictably, called me, his tone filled with concern. He urged me to reconsider, to be fair to her. I calmly explained the situation again, emphasizing that this was a workplace matter and not a personal vendetta. He didn't seem convinced, but I stood my ground. Jenny and Mark weren't far behind. They sent me scathing messages accusing me of ruining their mother's life. Jenny, in particular, was aggressive, claiming that I had always been jealous of their close family unit. Mark was slightly less confrontational but still implied that I was being unnecessarily harsh. I replied to both of them with a brief explanation of the situation, then cut off the conversation. I wasn't going to justify my actions to people who refused to see the bigger picture. The company ultimately decided to demote Veronica instead of firing her. She was reassigned to a lower position with significantly less responsibility and a pay cut. The news spread quickly, and the office gossip machine went into overdrive. People whispered about her downfall in break rooms and hallways, and it wasn't long before her reduced role became public knowledge. The humiliation was palpable, and even Veronica's usual confidence seemed to falter. Behind the scenes, I started hearing whispers about more financial trouble in her personal life. Mutual acquaintances mentioned that she and my dad were struggling to keep up with their mortgage and other expenses. It seemed like their years of living beyond their means were finally catching up to them. I wasn't sure what would happen next, but one thing was clear. Veronica's carefully constructed image was crumbling, both at work and at home. The fallout from Veronica's demotion at work was bad, but it wasn't the end of the chaos. A few weeks after her role was officially reduced, I started noticing changes in how my dad interacted with me. His usual calls, which were often lighthearted, became more frequent and laced with subtle hints about financial struggles. He didn't say it outright, but I could tell he was feeling the pinch of Veronica's reduced income. It wasn't long before Veronica called me directly, something she hadn't done in years. She sounded desperate, on the verge of tears, as she explained how they were falling behind on their mortgage payments and struggling to cover basic expenses. She asked me for financial help, framing it as a way to support family. I let her finish before calmly telling her no. She didn't take it well, accusing me of turning my back on them during their time of need. I ended the call before she could spiral further, but I knew this wouldn't be the last I'd hear of it. As expected, Jenny and Mark jumped into the fray almost immediately. Jenny sent me a long string of messages, calling me selfish and accusing me of abandoning my real family. Mark was less aggressive, but still took Veronica's side, saying I should help out because that's what families do. Their attacks were predictable, but they also made me curious about just how deep Veronica's financial mismanagement went. Something didn't add up. I started digging. Using public records and a few mutual connections, I uncovered a disturbing pattern. Veronica had taken out multiple loans over the years, several of which were in my dad's name. When I cross-checked the dates, I realized these loans lined up with some of their bigger lifestyle upgrades, like the new car she'd insisted on and the luxury vacations they couldn't afford. It became clear that my dad had no idea about most of these loans as they were taken out without his consent. I decided it was time to confront my dad. I showed him the evidence, laying out the details as clearly as I could. At first, he was in denial, insisting that Veronica wouldn't do something like that without telling him. But as I walked him through the paperwork, pointing out the inconsistencies and patterns, his defenses started to crumble. By the end of the conversation, he was quiet, his hands shaking slightly as he stared at the documents. Eventually, he admitted that he'd noticed some discrepancies in their finances over the years but had always dismissed them. He said he didn't want to rock the boat with Veronica, especially since she was the one managing their accounts after his early retirement. It was heartbreaking to see him so defeated, but I knew this was a necessary wake-up call. Veronica, of course, wasn't about to go down without a fight. When she found out I'd been investigating her finances, she called me again. This time, she didn't bother with tears. She accused me of trying to ruin her life and demanded that I stop interfering. I stood firm, refusing to back down. This wasn't just about her reckless behavior. It was about protecting my dad from further harm. Things escalated at work, too. Veronica's past mistakes, which had previously been brushed under the rug, began coming to light. Employees started speaking up about how she'd mismanaged projects and created a toxic work environment. The additional scrutiny led to her being formally let go from the company. It was a professional disaster for her, and it left no doubt about her capabilities or lack thereof. The final straw came during a family meeting I called to address everything. I laid out the financial evidence for everyone to see, explaining how Veronica had put my dad in a precarious position without his knowledge. Jenny, predictably, leaped to her mother's defense, accusing me of blowing things out of proportion. Mark, however, surprised me. For the first time, he seemed genuinely concerned and started asking questions about the loans and their impact on my dad. The confrontation ended with Veronica storming out, followed closely by Jenny. My dad stayed behind, and for the first time in years, he apologized to me. He admitted that he'd failed to protect me as a child, and acknowledged how Veronica's behavior had shaped my decision to distance myself from the family. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start. With Veronica out of a job, her lifestyle changed dramatically. She had to take a lower-paying position at a small firm, and the family's financial situation became much tighter. Jenny moved back in with her to help with expenses, while Mark reached out to me privately to apologize for his earlier comments. He said he was starting to see Veronica for who she really was, and we began rebuilding our relationship. Meanwhile, I focused on helping my dad regain some financial stability. We worked together to untangle the mess Veronica had created, setting up systems to ensure she couldn't take advantage of him again. It was a long process, but it felt like progress. Looking back, the events of the past few months felt like a whirlwind. Veronica's downfall was swift and messy, but it was also inevitable. As for me, I'm starting to see the possibility of a healthier relationship with my dad, though I've made it clear that my boundaries with Veronica remain firm. For now, I'm taking things one step at a time, knowing that the road ahead is still uncertain, but at least I'm finally in control. A few weeks after helping my dad sort through the financial mess Veronica had left behind, I got a call that caught me completely off guard. My dad had been hospitalized. The doctor said it was stress-related, a mix of high blood pressure and sheer emotional exhaustion. I didn't need to guess where that stress was coming from. Without hesitating, I made my way to the hospital to check on him. When I walked into his room, the first person I saw was Veronica. She was perched at his bedside, speaking in a low voice. The moment she noticed me, her expression hardened. Before I could even ask how my dad was doing, she launched into an attack, accusing me of pushing him to the brink. According to her, all the stress he was under was my fault. She painted herself as the supportive wife, trying to hold everything together while I played the role of the villain. Ignoring her accusations, I focused on my dad, who looked frail and exhausted. Once Veronica left the room to grab a coffee, I seized the opportunity to lay everything out. I showed him the documents I'd gathered, the loans taken out in his name, the irresponsible spending, and the financial holes she had dug them into. At first, he seemed hesitant, almost unwilling to believe it. But as I pointed out specific transactions and their timelines, something shifted. He sat quietly, staring at the papers, as the weight of the betrayal sank in. By the time Veronica returned, he was visibly shaken. She walked in with her usual bravado, but it faltered when she saw the papers spread out on his bedside table. My dad didn't say much, but his silence was louder than any words. The next day, Jenny and Mark arrived at the hospital. Jenny wasted no time jumping to Veronica's defense, accusing me of airing dirty laundry and creating unnecessary drama. Mark, however, stayed quiet, listening as I explained everything. I detailed the loans, the lies, and how Veronica had essentially gambled away their financial stability. It was a tense conversation, and Veronica tried multiple times to interrupt, but I didn't let her. Jenny doubled down, insisting that I was twisting the narrative to make Veronica look bad. Mark, however, finally spoke up. He asked Veronica point-blank if the loans were real, and if she had hidden them from their dad. She stumbled over her words, trying to deflect, but it was clear that Mark wasn't buying her excuses anymore. As the confrontation escalated, Veronica turned her attention back to me. She accused me of holding onto a grudge from childhood and using my position at work to ruin her life. She even tried to frame herself as the victim, saying she had always treated me like family and that this was how I repaid her. I didn't let her deflection slide. I calmly but firmly reminded her of the years of mistreatment, the hidden college acceptance letters, and the countless ways she had tried to hold me back. For the first time in my life, my dad stood up for me. He turned to Veronica and told her to stop blaming me for everything. He acknowledged that he had ignored the signs for too long and admitted that I was only trying to help. Veronica's face twisted in anger, but before she could respond, Mark jumped in. He demanded accountability, asking her how she could justify lying to their dad and putting their family in financial jeopardy. His words seemed to hit a nerve because, for the first time, Veronica didn't have a quick comeback. Jenny, on the other hand, was livid. She accused Mark of turning against their mother and blamed me for tearing the family apart. Mark didn't back down, pointing out that I had worked hard to build a stable life for myself while Veronica had spent years manipulating everyone around her. The tension in the room was unbearable, and when Veronica realized she was losing control of the narrative, she did what she always did. She stormed out. She made one last attempt to threaten my dad, warning him that if he didn't side with her, she'd cut him off financially. My dad didn't flinch. For the first time, he seemed to understand that her threats were empty. I reassured him that I would help him get back on his feet if needed, and that seemed to give him the courage to let go of the fear she had instilled in him for years. After Veronica left, my dad apologized to me. It wasn't a simple sorry. He admitted that he had failed me as a parent, that he had ignored my struggles to keep the peace in his marriage. He promised to work on rebuilding our relationship, and while it wasn't an instant fix, it was a step in the right direction. Mark and I left the hospital together that day. He expressed regret for not seeing through Veronica sooner and thanked me for standing up for their dad, even when it wasn't easy. Jenny, meanwhile, refused to speak to either of us, aligning herself completely with Veronica. In the weeks that followed, Veronica's absence became more noticeable. She had moved out of the house temporarily and was scrambling to find another job after being let go from her previous one. Her financial situation continued to worsen, and the lifestyle she had built on a shaky foundation was crumbling. For the first time in years, it felt like the family was starting to see her for who she really was. As for me, I wasn't ready to fully forgive my dad, but I was willing to try. One thing was certain: the power Veronica once held over all of us was gone, and there was no going back. After the events at the hospital, things began to shift. My dad, now fully aware of Veronica's financial betrayal, started making real efforts to rebuild his life. I helped him set up a separate bank account, untangled the web of loans she had taken in his name, and connected him with a financial advisor to prevent anything like this from happening again. It wasn't easy for him. He'd spent years relying on Veronica, but little by little, he started to regain his independence. Veronica, meanwhile, was spiraling. After losing her job and facing mounting debt, she moved in with Jenny. From what I heard through mutual acquaintances, she was still refusing to take responsibility for her actions, blaming everyone but herself. Jenny, ever loyal to her mother, seemed to feed into this narrative. She cut off all contact with Mark and me, calling us traitors for siding against family. It hurt to lose that connection, but at this point, I wasn't surprised. Mark, on the other hand, had completely changed. He started reaching out more, apologizing for how he had treated me in the past. He admitted that he had been blind to how Veronica had manipulated him and Jenny, and he thanked me for having the courage to stand up to her. Our relationship grew stronger, and it felt good to finally have an ally in all of this. We even started meeting regularly, sharing stories and rebuilding the trust that had been lost over the years. As for me, I threw myself into my work. The chaos with Veronica had been a distraction, but now that it was winding down, I could fully focus on my career. A few months later, I was promoted to an executive role, a position I had worked tirelessly to earn. It was a moment of validation, proof that I had truly escaped the toxic environment I grew up in and built a life on my own terms. Despite her downfall, Veronica wasn't done trying to worm her way back into my life. She called me out of the blue one evening, claiming she had changed and wanted to mend fences. Her tone was sweet, almost apologetic, but I wasn't buying it. I told her that while I wished her well, I wasn't interested in reconnecting. She tried a few more times, but I ignored her messages. I had no intention of reopening that chapter. Meanwhile, Jenny's unwavering loyalty to Veronica was beginning to backfire. Supporting their mother financially was taking a toll, and her own relationships were suffering. Friends who once sympathized with her were starting to distance themselves, tired of her constant defenses of Veronica's actions. Mark and I stayed out of it, but it was clear that her choice to stand by Veronica had left her increasingly isolated. One day, my dad invited me over for dinner. It was the first time in years that we sat down together, just the two of us. He thanked me for everything I had done, for helping him get back on his feet, and for being patient despite the years of neglect. He admitted that he had made mistakes, particularly in how he handled things after my mom left, but he promised to do better moving forward. It wasn't a perfect moment, but it was genuine, and for the first time I felt like we were truly starting to heal. Veronica, however, was facing the consequences of her actions. Unable to maintain her previous lifestyle, she was forced to sell the house she had once flaunted as a symbol of her success. She downsized to a small apartment, far removed from the luxury she had grown accustomed to. From what I heard, she was still clinging to her delusions, blaming everyone but herself for her downfall. A few months later, I decided to arrange one last family gathering. It wasn't an easy decision, but I felt like it was the only way to truly put everything on the table and offer some form of closure. Everyone showed up: my dad, Mark, Jenny, and even Veronica. As expected, the tension was thick. I laid out my intentions, emphasizing that this was an opportunity for everyone to move forward. Jenny remained defensive, refusing to acknowledge any wrongdoing on Veronica's part. Veronica herself stayed quiet for most of the evening, only speaking to deny her responsibility when pressed. Mark, however, surprised me again. He defended me, pointing out that I had done nothing but try to help the family while Veronica's actions had caused most of the problems. His words carried weight, and for the first time I saw a flicker of doubt cross Jenny's face. The meeting ended on a bittersweet note. Veronica stormed out, refusing to admit fault, while Jenny followed close behind. But my dad stayed back, along with Mark. We sat together, talking late into the night about how far we had come and how we could move forward. Now, as I reflect on everything, I feel a strange mix of emotions. The pain of my childhood and the years of mistreatment will always be a part of me, but they've also shaped who I am today. I've built a life that I'm proud of, free from the toxicity that once defined my family. My dad and I are closer than we've been in years, and Mark and I have finally found common ground. Veronica's choices have left her isolated and struggling, and while I don't wish her ill, I also have no desire to let her back into my life. Jenny's loyalty to her mother has cost her dearly, and though it's sad, I've accepted that I can't save everyone. For now, I'm focusing on the future, my career, my relationships, and the life I've worked so hard to build. The past may still linger, but it no longer defines me. It's a new chapter, and I'm ready to turn the page.